in the evolution of a butterfly, there is something called an imaginal disc that gets created as part of the transformation. So one way of looking at it is you start out with the caterpillar, which at a certain point, instead of just simply being in survival mode and sort of eating to maintain its own stasis, goes into a kind of hyperstasis where it eats almost compulsively and obsessively everything that's in its path and wraps itself up essentially in a kind of silk cocoon. What I think about in our business world is Tyco, the company in New York where the guy had the $6,000 umbrella stand and the $15,000, shower curtain. To me, this is wrapping yourself up in a silk cocoon. And it's part of the transformation where you're moving from enough wealth to sustain yourself to this kind of obsessive consumption that we see in the caterpillar, wrapping itself in a cocoon where it actually takes all the air out of the situation and begins to literally disintegrate into a kind of decadent, decaying goop on the inside. And it's that goop that starts to call forth out of its own sort of decaying mass. It literally, biologically, we're finding in the new biology that there is this dialectic where, a particular life form, when it intensifies itself in this way, calls forth its own antidote. And what gets called forth are what are called imaginal discs. Now, the reason I love the imaginal disc term in biology is that it reminds me of the imagination, and it reminds me of disc, like computer discs and technology. So that, imagination and technology don't have to be either or. They can be both and. And the thing that's so glorious about these imaginal discs is that as they manifest, they are eliminated and wiped out by the toxic soup of what's become of the caterpillar. And yet they keep coming forth. That's the great dialectic. The more toxic the environment becomes, the more imaginal discs get called forth. And as they're called forth, they're wiped out and consumed by the toxicity of the environment until they gradually proliferate to the point where the imaginal discs start to aggregate. And they still in the early stages get wiped out. But if they keep going, and they have to keep going because it's the nature of the process, eventually they aggregate to the point where there's a tipping point. And at that tipping point, which is sometimes, people refer to this as critical mass, a shift happens and the toxicity of the culture actually becomes the nutritive soup which inspires the imaginal discs to actually complexify and begin to develop the structure of what will become the butterfly. Now, if you look at butterflies, you see that, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's relatively low of the number of butterflies that emerge from this process. A lot of potential imaginal disc formations actually die aborning, and the caterpillar itself dies, and there's never a butterfly. So there's nothing guaranteed about this process. But nonetheless, to me, I find it very inspiring because it actually matches my experience for the last 45, 50 years, which is that I have been an imaginal disc, and I have been collaborating with and aggregating with various people, and then something happens and it falls apart and you move on, and then you aggregate with some other imaginal discs, and eventually, you find that you're not alone.